The sun streamed through the large windows of the gallery, casting an elegant light over the carefully curated collection of paintings that lined the walls. This was no ordinary gallery, it was one of the finest in the city, and its owner, Richard Masters, was a man who had built his reputation on exclusive taste. His gallery catered to a specific clientele: the wealthy, the elite, and the well-established in the art world. Masters was known for his sharp eye, his ability to identify artists who would become the next big thing, and for turning those artists into household names. He had the Midas touch when it came to art. Masters stood in front of a large painting by a contemporary artist he had recently discovered, admiring the brushstrokes and the intellectual depth it represented. His gallery was always a hub of activity, filled with the hum of excited conversations about the latest acquisitions and the growing buzz around certain artists. He could sense the art world's admiration for his taste and expertise. After all, he was known for spotting talent before it hit the mainstream. But behind the polished exterior of his business, Masters had a certain arrogance. He looked at the art world as a market, one that valued polish, precision, and sophistication. Anything that did not meet these standards was beneath his notice. And, for Masters, art wasn't just about expression, it was about investment. A piece of art was only valuable if it could command the right price in auctions and galleries, and that was where Masters excelled. Introduction of the Black Artist. In stark contrast to Richard Masters was a man named Elijah Williams. Elijah was a black artist who had spent years trying to find his footing in the world of fine art. His small apartment was scattered with unfinished canvases, and his brushes were often dried out from lack of use. He could barely afford to pay his bills, let alone buy the supplies he needed to improve his craft. Most of his work was sold in local street markets to people who appreciated his pieces, but his art was mostly dismissed by critics and galleries. Elijah's paintings told stories of struggle, of identity, of race, and of the human condition. Each stroke was infused with the pain and joy of living in a world that often ignored him. His work was raw, emotional, and often abstract. He wasn't interested in following trends or impressing art critics. Instead, he painted what he felt, what he lived, and what he believed the world needed to see. But despite the depth of his work, Elijah was largely unknown in the mainstream art world. He had sent his portfolio to countless galleries, but none of them ever responded. He would stand in front of other artists' displays at local events, watching them get the recognition he so desperately craved. His art was too bold, too loud, too different. No one seemed to see the genius in it, and that hurt more than he was willing to admit. Still, Elijah refused to give up. He painted every day, driven by the belief that one day, someone would see the worth in his work. Even if the world turned its back on him now, he knew that he would find a way to make his voice heard. The encounter. One crisp autumn afternoon, the local art fair was buzzing with activity. The small venue was packed with vendors, artists, and buyers, each trying to make a name for themselves in the crowded market. Richard Masters, dressed in his usual designer suit, strolled through the aisles with an air of confidence. His eyes scanned the artwork, assessing each piece with a calculated gaze. He was used to being the one who set the tone for the industry, and he had little patience for artists who did not fit the mold. As Masters made his way around the fair, he passed by a small booth tucked into the corner. At first, he barely noticed the paintings that hung on the walls. They were messy, chaotic, and undeniably bold. But there was something in their colors, something raw and untamed, that caught his eye. He stepped closer, studying a large painting that depicted a figure, tall and dark, standing against a background of fiery oranges and reds. The face of the figure was almost indistinguishable, a mix of abstract shapes and splashes of color. "This is ridiculous," Masters muttered to himself, stepping back from the painting. The edges were uneven, the lines jagged, and the form, though striking, lacked the refinement Masters was accustomed to. He glanced around the booth and saw more of the same art that seemed more like an emotional outpouring than a calculated masterpiece. The booth owner, a young man with dreadlocks and a worn-out shirt, stood beside the display, waiting for potential buyers. Masters scoffed. "Amateur," he whispered under his breath. He didn't realize that the artist standing just a few feet away, quietly observing him, was Elijah himself. He had hoped that this fair would be the one where someone finally recognized his talent, but now, the gallery owner was mocking him without even knowing who he was. Elijah's heart sank as he overheard the words. He wanted to confront the man, but something stopped him. He wasn't sure if it was the years of rejection or the fear of being dismissed yet again, but Elijah chose silence. The art world had already rejected him. What difference did it make if one more person did the same? The artist's resolve. As the day wore on, Elijah packed up his booth, his fingers stiff from the long hours of standing and interacting with customers who often barely glanced at his work. His resolve was tested, but he refused to let the gallery owner's dismissal define him. As he loaded the last of his canvases into his car, he looked up at the sky, the same fiery colors from his paintings reflecting in the clouds. "This isn't the end," he whispered to himself. Elijah had spent his whole life battling the odds. Whether it was growing up in a rough neighborhood or struggling to be seen in an art world that only valued a certain type of artist. His work was his voice, and he would not let anyone silence it. If masters didn't see the value in his paintings, that was his loss. But Elijah knew that time would prove him wrong. He made a vow to himself that day: he would continue to paint, to pour his soul onto each canvas, and to one day show the world what they had missed. His work had meaning. His work had purpose. And one day, it would be undeniable. With a deep breath, Elijah got into his car and drove off, the streets blurring beneath him as he focused on his future. It would be a long road, but he was ready. The art begins to gain attention. As the months passed, Elijah's life began to shift. Slowly, his works, which had once been dismissed as unrefined and too raw, started to gain attention. It began in small, unexpected places: an art dealer in a nearby city, a private collector who had a keen eye for what was new and different, and a few key art critics who saw the potential in his work before anyone else. Elijah's name started circulating in underground art circles, and his pieces were being quietly bought and sold behind closed doors, far from the glare of mainstream art galleries. These collectors were not looking for what the art world called polish or sophistication. They were looking for something real, something that conveyed emotion and identity in a way that most contemporary art didn't. Elijah's work resonated with them. It spoke to the struggles of everyday people, the complexities of identity, and the weight of history. It was raw, honest, and completely authentic. Those who bought his pieces did so because they felt connected to them in a way they didn't feel with other art. It wasn't just about ownership, it was about holding on to something that felt alive. Elijah, for his part, stayed in the shadows. He didn't want the attention, didn't need the recognition. He knew that in the art world, success could be fleeting, and he didn't want to get too caught up in the hype. Instead, he kept his focus on his craft, pouring more of himself into each new piece he created. He wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone, least of all the dismissive gallery owners who had brushed him aside. But his art was proving itself. As his reputation grew, so did the interest in his work. Collectors from all over the world were soon lining up to buy his pieces, though many still remained unaware of the artist's true identity. They admired the paintings and sculptures they had purchased, but did not yet know who was behind them. And that, Elijah thought, was fine. It wasn't the recognition he sought, it was the belief that his work had meaning, that it would live on beyond the galleries and the auction houses. A key piece is auctioned. One of Elijah's works, a large abstract canvas filled with vivid reds, oranges, and deep purples, was unexpectedly sold at a high-profile art auction. The piece depicted a swirling vortex of color, capturing a sense of both anguish and joy, a juxtaposition of emotions that mirrored Elijah's own experiences growing up. The piece had taken him weeks to complete, and he had poured every ounce of his soul into it. It was a piece that carried the weight of his journey, a testament to his resilience and his ability to transform pain into beauty. The auction was a turning point. The piece, listed as a contemporary abstract painting by an unknown artist, caught the eye of a famous international art collector, a wealthy businessman with a penchant for acquiring rare, one-of-a-kind pieces. When the bidding began, the room was filled with an energy that Elijah had never experienced. The price quickly climbed to astronomical levels, well beyond the value most people would have placed on the work. When the auctioneer's gavel finally came down, the painting had sold for millions of dollars. It was the highest-selling piece of the night, and the name of the artist was still unrecognized by the wider public. But the collector, who had purchased the piece, knew exactly what they were buying: a masterpiece. Elijah, unaware that his painting had sold for such a staggering amount, continued with his daily life, still focused on his work, still keeping a low profile. The art world, however, was starting to take notice. The auction had sparked a frenzy of interest in the unknown artist, and whispers of his name spread quickly through the elite art circles. Yet, no one knew who Elijah Williams was. He had no public persona, no gallery representation, no marketing machine behind him. He was simply an artist whose work spoke for itself. A shift in the artist's life. With the money from his successful paintings, Elijah's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. His newfound success allowed him to travel, to explore new artistic influences, and to refine his craft. No longer confined to the small, cramped apartment where he had once struggled, Elijah rented a studio space in a quiet part of the city, a place where he could truly immerse himself in his work. He traveled to art hubs like Paris, Berlin, and New York, absorbing the culture and the energy of the art world. He met other artists, collaborated with creatives from different disciplines, and found himself inspired by new techniques and mediums. He began incorporating sculpture into his work, using metal, wood, and clay to create striking, abstract forms that complemented the themes of his paintings. His installations, once simple and intimate, grew in scale and complexity. Elijah started pushing boundaries, breaking down the barriers between different art forms and using his work as a way to explore identity and the human experience in more profound ways. But through it all, Elijah remained humble. He kept his personal life private, rarely appearing at gallery events or art shows. The world had never been kind to him, and he wasn't ready to expose himself to that kind of scrutiny again. Instead, he chose to let his art speak for him, trusting that, one day, it would all come to light. The more success he found, the more deeply he immersed himself in his craft. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone, especially to those who had once dismissed him. But there was a quiet fire burning inside him, a desire to show the world what they had missed, to demonstrate that art wasn't about fitting into a mold, but about creating something that moved people, that made them feel something real. The moment of revenge. After months of quiet success, Elijah's path crossed with Richard Masters once again. He had been following the developments in the art world, and he knew that Masters' gallery was still one of the top institutions in the city. The thought of the gallery owner dismissing his work all those months ago had never left Elijah's mind. Masters had no idea that the very artist he had mocked was now a success, his works were fetching millions of dollars, and his name was becoming synonymous with cutting-edge contemporary art. Elijah, now more confident than ever, decided that it was time to pay a visit to Masters' gallery. He wanted to see for himself how the gallery owner would react to the increased value of his art, and whether he would recognize the pieces that had once been dismissed. The thought of Masters, once so sure of himself, unknowingly selling his own works to a private buyer, at a fraction of their true worth, was something Elijah couldn't resist. He walked into the gallery with a sense of calm determination. The moment he stepped through the door, the familiar ambience of polished wood floors and spotlights highlighting expensive artwork washed over him. Masters, as always, was standing in front of a piece, talking to a client. Elijah approached, blending into the crowd of art enthusiasts, watching. He didn't need to say anything to Masters just yet. His presence alone was enough to make the gallery owner uneasy. Elijah's art had already done the talking. He just had to wait for the moment to arrive. The artist reappears at the gallery. Elijah stood outside the prestigious gallery, staring at the gleaming windows. He could see the reflection of the city's skyline in the glass, a stark contrast to the small, humble beginnings from which he had come. His heart beat in a steady rhythm, and the decision to step inside seemed both thrilling and unsettling. Today was the day he would face Richard Masters again, but this time, he would do so on his own terms. Taking a deep breath, Elijah pushed open the door and walked into the gallery. The atmosphere was what he had expected, refined, elegant, and steeped in an air of exclusivity. The white walls were adorned with high-end art pieces, and soft lighting illuminated each canvas, giving them an almost ethereal glow. Elijah's eyes wandered over the works on display, noting the familiar polished style of many renowned artists. The pieces were beautiful, yes, but they lacked the raw emotion he had always strived to convey in his own work. He was greeted by a young assistant, who smiled politely and asked if he needed assistance. Elijah, now dressed in a tailored suit that reflected the newfound wealth he had acquired, politely declined. His goal today wasn't to buy something, at least not for himself. He was here to watch, to observe. And, more importantly, to see how Richard Masters would react to the work that had once been dismissed. From the corner of the room, Elijah saw Masters himself, standing near a large painting of a landscape, discussing it with an older couple. The gallery owner's sharp eye was evident even from a distance. He carefully pointed out the subtle nuances in the color palette and how the artist had masterfully captured the interplay of light and shadow. Elijah could see the air of superiority that clung to Masters. The man was still the same, his world still revolving around only the most prestigious names in art, dismissing anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of greatness. It was then that Masters noticed Elijah from across the room. He raised an eyebrow, as if he recognized something vaguely familiar about the man but couldn't place it. Elijah met his gaze, his face calm and unreadable. There was no hint of recognition in his eyes, nothing that would betray the truth. Instead, he simply gave a polite nod. Mockery continues. Masters, still puzzled by the man before him, slowly approached. Elijah could see the shift in his demeanor as the gallery owner began to size him up, his usual confidence giving way to a subtle uncertainty. "I don't believe we've met," Masters said, his voice smooth, but with a touch of condescension. "You have the look of someone with a discerning eye. May I ask what you think of the collection?" Elijah, who had spent years studying art and its various forms, knew exactly what to say. "It's a fine collection," he replied, his tone respectful yet neutral. "I can see the technical mastery in some of the pieces, but I find myself drawn to the ones that have more of an emotional edge. Art that challenges the viewer rather than simply pleases them." Masters' lips curled into a thin smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, yes, the emotional edge," he said dismissively. "It's always the loudest works that get the attention, isn't it? The ones that make a statement. But art, true art, should be more than just a chaotic outpouring. It should have sophistication, nuance. Take, for example, this piece." Masters gestured toward a nearby painting, one that depicted a serene, minimalist scene. Elijah's eyes briefly flicked to the painting, his expression unreadable. He could see it for what it was, technically perfect, perhaps, but lifeless. The kind of piece that would appeal to an audience more interested in status than substance. "I see," Elijah said softly, his gaze moving back to Masters. "But isn't art also about breaking free from convention? I believe there's something to be said for the rawness of emotion. Sometimes, it's the imperfections that make it unique." Masters' smile tightened. "Indeed, but raw emotion without technique often falls short of being true art," he replied, his tone still patronizing. "It can be unsophisticated, unpolished." Elijah said nothing, but inside, he couldn't help but smile to himself. Masters hadn't changed. He was still the same man who had dismissed him not long ago. The same man who had mocked the very works that were now being sold for millions. But Elijah wasn't interested in confronting him directly, not yet. Instead, he stood quietly, listening to Masters talk about various artists, all of whom fit the mold of sophistication in the gallery owner's eyes. The artist's first purchase. As the conversation shifted to more general topics, Elijah's mind began to formulate a quiet plan. He had visited the gallery with one specific goal in mind, to make a statement, to show Masters just how wrong he had been. And, to do so, he would make a purchase, a significant one. With a calm, purposeful gesture, Elijah turned toward a row of paintings that caught his eye. They were works by established artists, each one priced far higher than their true artistic value. The pieces, though polished, lacked the emotional weight that Elijah had always sought in art. It was exactly the type of work masters would champion, and it was precisely the kind of art that was, in Elijah's eyes, so empty. He moved closer to a painting that seemed almost laughable in its pretension, a landscape bathed in an unnatural light, its colors muted and uninspired. The price tag on it was exorbitant, but Elijah was no longer concerned with cost. With a slow, deliberate motion, he signaled to the gallery assistant, who promptly arrived to offer assistance. "I'll take this one," Elijah said, pointing to the painting. The assistant's eyes widened in surprise, but Elijah was already moving toward another piece, a sculpture by a renowned artist, another master whose works were considered highly valuable, yet, in Elijah's eyes, nothing more than hollow showpieces. Without hesitation, he added it to his selection. Within minutes, Elijah had purchased several pieces, each one priced far beyond what they were truly worth. Masters, who had been standing nearby, was momentarily speechless. His trained eye, which had once dismissed Elijah's work, couldn't grasp why this man, who had seemingly no interest in art beyond the market, was suddenly buying up pieces that fit his exact ideals. "Excellent choices," Masters said, though his voice held a hint of confusion. "I'm sure these pieces will fit wonderfully in your collection. You certainly have an eye for taste." Elijah, however, remained composed, not revealing the truth. He paid for the pieces and left the gallery with the same calm demeanor he had entered with. But the look on Master's face, the lingering confusion, the faint unease, was enough for Elijah to know that his message had been received. Subtle tension. Over the next few days, Elijah continued to visit the gallery, buying more pieces, each one a testament to the elitism that Masters represented. With each purchase, the gallery owner's unease grew. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, on his ability to separate the serious collectors from the casual buyers. But something about Elijah was gnawing at him. The man had no apparent background in art collecting, and yet, he seemed to know more about the pieces and their creators than most. His deep knowledge of the history of art, the techniques used by the masters, and the value of certain artists, was unsettling. There was a strange air about him, calm, almost too calm, for someone so willing to buy such high-priced pieces. Masters couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Elijah than he had initially assumed. It was as if the man were playing some kind of game, but Masters couldn't figure out the rules. A sense of unease began to take root in the gallery owner's mind. Who was this man? Why did he seem so familiar, and why was he purchasing art that, to Masters, seemed beneath him? It was clear that Elijah was no ordinary buyer. Something about him didn't sit right. The question that haunted Masters was simple: who was he really dealing with? A shocking turn of events. The moment had arrived. Elijah stood in front of Richard Masters' gallery once again, but this time he was not a humble visitor. He was not the anonymous buyer who had silently made purchases to expose the man's ignorance. Today, he would reveal himself, and in doing so, he would turn everything Masters believed about the art world on its head. Elijah had been making his final rounds through the gallery, carefully observing the staff, the artwork, and, of course, Masters himself. The tension in the air had only grown over the last few weeks, as Elijah's identity had begun to dawn on the gallery owner. Masters had spent countless hours contemplating the man who kept returning to buy art, always with such calm and discernment, yet always slipping out of his grasp. There was something about him, a quiet confidence, a reserved demeanor that seemed out of place in the world of high art and pomp. Finally, the moment came when Masters stood in front of a new piece, a large abstract canvas depicting a tumult of color and movement. It was bold, chaotic, and undeniably emotional. Masters was admiring it. When Elijah approached him once again, this time, the artist did not hold back. He took a deep breath and walked right up to the man who had once dismissed him. "I believe you owe me an apology," Elijah said calmly, his voice carrying an edge that Masters had never heard before. He did not wait for Masters to respond, but instead continued, revealing the truth. I am Elijah Williams, the artist whose work you mocked not so long ago. Masters froze. His face drained of color as the realization hit him. The man standing before him was none other than the artist whose paintings had been quietly dominating the art world, fetching millions of dollars in private auctions. The same man whose work he had dismissed as unpolished and unsophisticated. And now, here he was, the very artist he had once belittled, standing before him. Elijah's calm expression remained unchanged as he let the weight of the moment settle between them. Yes, it's true, Elijah continued. I've been buying your art, not because I care for it, but because I wanted you to know who I really am. And I wanted to show you what your dismissal of my work has cost you. The gallery owner's realization. Masters stood there in stunned silence, the arrogance he had always worn like a second skin slipping away. He had prided himself on his ability to judge art, to know which pieces were worthy and which were not. He had dismissed Elijah's work with a wave of his hand, assuming it was nothing more than the product of an untalented amateur. But now, standing before him was the very artist whose works had become the talk of the art world. Pieces that Masters had rejected, had sneered at, were now valued at millions of dollars. The weight of the insult he had delivered to Elijah years ago now hung heavily over him. His pride, built on years of curating only the most worthy pieces, was shattered. In that moment, Masters realized that he had made a colossal mistake, not just with Elijah, but with the very foundation of the art world he had once considered himself an authority over. His judgment had been clouded by elitism, by his own narrow view of what constituted true art. And now, his world was crumbling. Elijah watched as Masters' expression flickered between disbelief and regret. There was no need for Elijah to say more. The gallery owner had finally understood the truth. He had mocked a man who was now his equal, if not his superior, in the very world he had built his career upon. The artist's revenge. With a quiet sense of satisfaction, Elijah spoke again. I've been watching you, Richard. Watching how you treat artists like me, how you dismiss anything that doesn't fit your narrow view of what art should be. You didn't know who I was when you mocked my work. But now you do. Elijah's words were calm, measured, but they carried a power that shook Masters to his core. The truth is, I didn't come here for your apology, Richard. I came here to show you the hypocrisy of this world, to expose how the so-called elite art world works. It's a game of power, of wealth, and of status. It's not about art. It's about who you know, who can afford your pieces, and who can dictate the value of an artist's work. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. I could have easily ignored this. I could have stayed in the shadows and let you continue in your bubble of false superiority. But I wanted you to know that I see it all. And now, you see me. Elijah's gaze was unwavering. You called my work unpolished, unsophisticated. But the truth is, my art is real. It's raw. And that's why it's succeeding. Not because of some gallery owner's approval, but because it speaks to something deeper. Something you'll never understand. Masters, though silent, stood frozen, his mouth slightly ajar, his mind racing. He had spent years elevating artists who fit his idea of what was worthy. And now, that world was falling apart. The artist he had ridiculed had become the very figure that would expose his limitations, his narrow-mindedness, and his blindness to true talent. The gallery's downfall. Word of Elijah's revelation spread quickly. News outlets, art critics, and social media exploded with the story of how Richard Masters had mocked one of the most successful and influential artists of the time. The irony was too much to ignore. The gallery owner who had rejected Elijah's work was now publicly shamed by the very success of the artist he had dismissed. The art world, once a fortress of elitism and exclusivity, was forced to confront its own flaws. Masters' Gallery, once considered one of the most prestigious in the city, began to lose its reputation. Collectors who had once flocked to the gallery now questioned its credibility. Artists who had once sought representation with masters now turned away, wary of being judged based on outdated notions of art and status. The very people who had supported Masters' gallery began to pull away, embarrassed by their association with someone who had been so publicly humiliated. The fall was swift and unforgiving. The gallery's sales began to dwindle, and Masters' name, once synonymous with success, now carried the weight of his arrogance. The art world had no patience for those who were slow to adapt, and Masters had failed to recognize the changing tides. As for Elijah, he remained unaffected by the chaos that surrounded him. He had never sought revenge for the sake of it. What mattered to him was the message he had sent, and the statement he had made. His art was now celebrated for its depth, its emotion, and its authenticity. His work was no longer just a collection of paintings, it was a movement, a testament to the power of perseverance and self-belief. While Masters grappled with the consequences of his dismissal, Elijah moved forward, using his success not just for personal gain, but to bring attention to the artists who had been overlooked by the very system Masters had championed. Elijah's story was one of redemption, not just for himself, but for every artist who had ever been told they weren't good enough. And with each new piece he created, he solidified his place as one of the most powerful voices in the art world. And as for Richard Masters, he was left alone, watching as the gallery he had built crumbled under the weight of his own pride, a painful reminder of the man he had once mocked, now the very force that would bring down his empire. The artist's triumph. Elijah's journey had taken him from the streets of obscurity to the grand stages of the art world. His name was no longer whispered in the dark corners of underground galleries or private auctions, it was shouted from the rooftops. What had once been dismissed as unpolished and unsophisticated was now celebrated as raw brilliance, a true reflection of the human spirit. His work became a symbol of resilience, an embodiment of overcoming adversity, defying expectations, and triumphing over the prejudice that had once nearly crushed him. It wasn't just the art world that took notice, it was the world at large. His story of persistence against a system that tried to silence him resonated with people from all walks of life. Elijah was no longer just an artist, he had become a symbol of change, of the power that comes from refusing to be overlooked. His exhibitions were packed, and his work was displayed in the most prestigious galleries across the globe, places that had once refused him. Paris, New York, London, and Berlin, all the great cities of the art world were now hosting exhibitions of Elijah Williams' paintings and sculptures. His once humble works, filled with raw emotion and unrefined edges, were now seen as masterpieces. They transcended their medium. They weren't just pieces of art, they were statements. Statements about identity, about the struggle for recognition, and about the resilience of the human spirit. Critics who had once dismissed him now wrote glowing reviews, and collectors were willing to pay astronomical sums for his pieces. The very same art world that had rejected him had now embraced him as one of its greatest treasures. But Elijah remained grounded. Despite his growing fame, he never forgot where he came from. His success wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had ever been dismissed for being different, for thinking outside the box, for being too raw or too unpolished. His success, he realized, wasn't just about art, it was about changing the world. The gallery's decline. While Elijah's rise was meteoric, Richard Masters' fall was swift and unforgiving. The art world, fickle as it was, had no place for those who refused to adapt, who clung to outdated views of what art should be. Masters, once the celebrated curator of one of the most prestigious galleries in the city, found himself struggling to maintain relevance. The art community turned its back on him as news of his public humiliation spread like wildfire. His gallery, once a bustling center of high-society art buyers and wealthy collectors, now stood empty. Artists who had once aspired to be represented by Masters now found their homes in other galleries, galleries that celebrated diversity, creativity, and the voices of those who had been long ignored. Those who had seen the true potential in Elijah's work, and in the works of countless other underrepresented artists, now thrived. Masters watched helplessly as his empire crumbled, all the while unable to shake the sting of his arrogance. His dismissive attitude toward Elijah had not only destroyed his own reputation but had exposed the shallow nature of the very system he had helped create. Collectors, once loyal to his gallery, now questioned his taste and judgment. No longer was he the authority in the art world, now, he was a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when ego blinds you to true talent. As the years passed, Master's gallery was forced to close its doors. What remained of his once glorious empire was reduced to nothing more than a sad, empty space, filled with the ghosts of former successes. The artist he had rejected, the one he had once mocked, was now the one who had taken his place in the spotlight, and Masters had no one but himself to blame. A legacy is born. While the fall of Masters marked the end of one era, for Elijah, it marked the beginning of something much larger. He realized that his success was about more than just himself. He had made it to the top, but there were countless others like him, artists who had been overlooked, dismissed, and rejected simply because they didn't fit the narrow definition of what art should be. With his newfound wealth and influence, Elijah decided to use his platform for good. He started a foundation dedicated to supporting emerging artists, particularly those from marginalized communities. The foundation's goal was simple: to ensure that no artist, regardless of their background, would ever face the kind of rejection he had faced. The foundation provided grants, mentorship, and exhibition opportunities for young artists who needed a chance to show their work to the world. Elijah's foundation became a beacon for underrepresented voices in the art world. It was a place where artists could find the support they needed to thrive, a place where raw talent was nurtured rather than ignored. Elijah used his own story as a reminder to those artists that success wasn't about fitting in, it was about standing out, being true to your vision, and refusing to be silenced. His legacy was no longer just about his own art, it was about empowering the next generation of artists who had a story to tell. The closing scene. The final scene unfolded in one of the most prestigious art galleries in the world, a place that had once rejected Elijah's work. Now, it was filled with people from all walks of life, critics, collectors, and art enthusiasts, all admiring the new collection of Elijah Williams paintings. Each canvas was filled with vivid colors, raw emotion, and a sense of urgency. His work was as powerful as ever, speaking to the struggles and triumphs of life itself. Elijah stood quietly in front of his newest collection, a soft smile playing at the corners of his lips as he watched the crowd. They were admiring his art, but more importantly, they were admiring the journey he had taken to get there. From being a struggling artist, dismissed by those who thought they knew better, to becoming one of the most influential voices in the art world, his journey had come full circle. He didn't need the applause. He didn't need the accolades. The recognition, while appreciated, wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that he had stayed true to himself. What mattered was that he had proven that no one, no matter how powerful or influential, could ever define his worth. He had done it his way, and in doing so, he had created something that would last beyond the confines of galleries and auctions. His art would live on as a testament to the power of resilience, creativity, and the refusal to be overlooked. As Elijah stood there, reflecting on how far he had come, he realized that his journey was far from over. There were still so many stories to tell, so many voices to lift up. But for now, as he watched the crowd admiring his work, he smiled quietly to himself. He had fought for his place in the world, and now, he had found it. The story of Elijah Williams, the artist who had been dismissed and mocked but had triumphed in the end, was a story not just of art, but of hope, courage, and the power of never giving up. And as the night went on, with people from all over the world admiring his work, Elijah knew that his journey, his legacy, had only just begun. The story closed with a quiet, contented smile on Elijah's face, knowing that he had made his mark, not just as an artist, but as a force for change.